The sun blazed down on the quiet streets of Cedar Heights, a small town where everybody knew each other's business, or at least thought they did. On this particular afternoon, two cops, Officers Rick Carson and Jake Miller, sat in their patrol car parked outside a rundown diner. Rick leaned back in his seat, sunglasses on, smirking as he recounted a story about a big score they'd made just last week. Jake chuckled nervously, but his eyes darted around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Inside the diner, a man walked in. He was tall, with deep brown skin, a confident stride, and a quiet demeanor that seemed to command respect. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, he didn't look like someone who would stand out in Cedar Heights, except for the fact that he was new in town. Rick noticed him first, nudging Jake. "Check this out," he muttered, tipping his head toward the diner window. Jake glanced over, his grin fading into something meaner. "Looks like an out-of-towner. Probably lost," Rick added with a smirk. The man ordered a coffee to go and stepped back outside, where he began to count a thick stack of cash. Rick's eyes widened. "Would you look at that?" he said, his voice dripping with greed. "Easy pickings." Before long, the patrol car rolled up next to the man. Rick stepped out first, his swagger exaggerated, while Jake followed close behind, his hand resting on the holster of his taser. "Hey, buddy," Rick called out, his tone laced with mock friendliness. "Mind telling us what you're doing around here?" The man looked up, calm but clearly unimpressed. "Just passing through," he replied evenly, his deep voice steady. Rick's smile tightened as he glanced at the money. "That's a lot of cash you've got there. You sure it's yours?" The man's expression didn't change. "It's mine." Jake piped up, his tone sharper. "We're gonna need to see some ID." "Just routine," he said, though everyone present knew there was nothing routine about it. The man handed over his ID without protest, but as soon as Rick saw the name, his smirk turned into a sneer. "Ah, Derek Collins. Nice name. But this kind of money doesn't seem like it adds up, Derek." What happened next was humiliating. Rick and Jake searched the man, taking the cash while making comments under their breath that Derek chose to ignore. They even made him kneel on the pavement under the guise of protocol, attracting the attention of passersby. What the two officers didn't know was that Derek Collins wasn't just any man. He wasn't a tourist or a drifter passing through Cedar Heights. Derek Collins was their new chief of police, and he had just arrived in town, unannounced, to assess his team. As Derek stood, brushing the dust from his slacks, his sharp eyes lingered on the two officers. "I'll be seeing you both very soon," he said, his tone calm, but with a weight that made Jake flinch. Rick laughed it off. "Yeah, sure, buddy. You do that." Derek walked away without another word, but in his mind, the wheels were already turning. This wasn't going to be just about getting his money back. No, this was going to be about justice and making sure Rick and Jake learned a lesson they'd never forget. The question wasn't whether they'd regret their actions. It was how soon. And as Rick and Jake drove off, still chuckling, they had no idea that the man they'd just humiliated was about to turn their world upside down. This introduction sets the tone with suspense and leaves the audience eager to find out what happens next. Rick and Jake returned to their patrol car, laughing as they stuffed the confiscated cash into a duffel bag stashed in the trunk. To them, it was just another day, another perk of wearing the badge in Cedar Heights. For years, they'd operated under the radar, picking their targets carefully, usually people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. They saw Derek as no different, just another unlucky soul passing through their small, forgotten town. But Derek wasn't just passing through. As he walked down the street, his mind churned with everything he'd just witnessed. This wasn't the first time he dealt with bad cops. During his years in law enforcement, Derek had built his career on rooting out corruption, taking assignments in some of the toughest precincts in the state. He thought he'd seen it all, but what happened today hit differently. Cedar Heights was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to work with a smaller team and get closer to the community. Derek had specifically requested this transfer after hearing about the town's struggles with rebuilding trust between law enforcement and residents. But now, only hours into his first day, he realized the job would be far more complicated than he'd imagined. He stopped at the small motel where he'd been staying under the radar, pulled out his phone, and called the mayor. Mayor Evelyn Ross was the one who pushed for Derek's appointment as chief, insisting that Cedar Heights needed someone with his experience and integrity. "Evelyn, it's Derek," he said once she picked up. "I need to talk to you, tonight, if possible." Her voice was warm but concerned. "Of course, Chief." "Everything okay?" "We'll discuss it in person," Derek replied. "It's important." Evelyn agreed to meet him at her office after hours. As Derek hung up, he glanced out the motel window. A part of him wanted to confront Rick and Jake immediately, but he knew better. They'd been too confident, too comfortable in their behavior. If he wanted to dismantle their operation and restore integrity to the department, he'd have to play the long game. Meanwhile, Rick and Jake continued their shift, unaware that their new chief had already started unraveling their carefully constructed facade. Rick, the ringleader, was a textbook bully, loud, cocky, and always looking for an easy target. Jake, on the other hand, was quieter, more insecure. He followed Rick's lead, not because he enjoyed the power trip, but because he feared standing up to him. As they cruised the streets, Rick turned to Jake. "You're awful quiet," he said, tossing a piece of gum into his mouth. Jake shrugged, staring out the window. "I don't know, man. Something about that guy didn't sit right with me." Rick laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You worry too much. He's nobody. Just another guy who didn't know when to keep his head down." Jake nodded, but his unease lingered. Back at the mayor's office, Derek laid everything out for Evelyn. He described the encounter in detail, watching her face shift from shock to anger to determination. "This isn't the first complaint I've heard about Rick and Jake," Evelyn admitted, folding her hands on the desk. "But we've never had solid evidence. Most people are too scared to come forward." Derek nodded. "I get that. They know how to pick their targets, people who won't speak up or can't afford to. But they made a mistake this time." "What's your plan?" Evelyn asked, leaning forward. Derek's expression hardened. "I want to investigate the entire department. If these two are dirty, there's a good chance others are too. I need your support to do this quietly, at least for now." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "You have it. Do whatever it takes to clean this up." With the mayor's backing, Derek started his quiet investigation. The next morning, he officially introduced himself to the department. Rick and Jake were in the room, their smirks barely concealed as Derek stood at the front, outlining his vision for the team. "I believe in accountability," Derek said, his eyes scanning the room. "Not just for the people we serve, but for ourselves. We wear this badge to protect and serve, not to exploit or intimidate." Rick leaned back in his chair, nudging Jake. "He talks a good game," he muttered under his breath. Derek's gaze landed on him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Rick's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he looked away. Over the next few weeks, Derek observed the department closely. He reviewed old complaints, spoke with community members, and started building a picture of just how deep the corruption ran. Rick and Jake's names came up repeatedly, but they weren't the only ones. Derek's methodical approach frustrated Rick, who couldn't shake the feeling that the new chief was watching him. "I don't like him," Rick said one evening as he and Jake sat in the patrol car. "He's poking around too much." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should lay low for a while, just until things blow over." Rick scoffed. "You're scared of him. He's just another pencil pusher trying to make a name for himself." But deep down, Rick wasn't as confident as he pretended to be. He could feel the walls closing in, though he didn't know how or when the fallout would come. Derek, meanwhile, was biding his time. He didn't just want to catch Rick and Jake in the act. He wanted to dismantle the entire culture that had allowed them to thrive. And for that, he needed undeniable evidence. One evening, Derek visited a local diner where he'd heard some of Rick and Jake's previous victims spend time. He struck up conversations, asking questions without revealing too much. Slowly, people began to open up. A young man named Marcus, who worked as a dishwasher, shared his story hesitantly. "They took my money, too," he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Said I looked suspicious. I tried to file a complaint, but nothing ever came of it." Derek's reinforcements had arrived. Karen Lopes had followed Derek's orders to the letter, coordinating with trusted officers to ensure they were ready to intervene at the right moment. The tide was turning, and Derek could see the realization dawn on Rick and Donnie's faces. "Looks like I'm not the one outnumbered," Derek said, his voice calm but resolute. The men who had arrived with Donnie hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. It was clear they hadn't anticipated facing a fully mobilized police force. Derek seized the moment. "This is your chance to walk away," he said, addressing the newcomers. "Whatever loyalty you think you owe Donnie, it's not worth your freedom." One by one, the men began backing toward the exit, their resolve crumbling. Donnie cursed under his breath, his plan unraveling before his eyes. Rick, however, wasn't ready to give up. In a desperate move, he lunged toward Derek, his fist swinging wildly. Derek sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, grabbing Rick's arm and twisting it behind his back. Rick struggled, but Derek held firm, his training and composure winning out. "It's over, Rick," Derek said, his voice steady. "Stop fighting." Jake, who had watched the entire scene unfold, finally cracked under the pressure. He dropped to his knees, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." Donnie, seeing his carefully constructed empire collapse, tried to make a run for it, but the officers outside were ready. He was quickly apprehended, his protests drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. As the dust settled, Derek stood in the center of the warehouse, his heart pounding but his expression calm. The main players had been taken down, their web of corruption exposed. But just as he began to feel the weight of victory, Karen approached him, her expression grave. "Chief," she said quietly, handing him a folder. "We found this in Rick's patrol car. You're going to want to see it." Derek opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents inside. They weren't just records of Rick and Donnie's activities. They were connections to higher-ups in the town, names of individuals Derek hadn't even suspected. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined, and while tonight was a victory, it was clear the fight was far from over. Derek closed the folder, his resolve hardening. Cedar Heights wasn't free yet, but for the first time in years, the town had hope. And Derek wasn't going to stop until every last thread of corruption was unraveled. As the early hours of the morning approached, the streets of Cedar Heights began to quiet, the chaos of the night finally subsiding. Derek stood outside the warehouse, watching as Rick, Jake, and Donnie were loaded into separate patrol cars. Their faces were a mixture of anger, shame, and fear, emotions Derek had seen countless times before, but never in such a deeply personal way. For weeks, these men had tried to undermine him, to strip him of his authority and integrity. But now, justice was finally taking its course. Karen stood beside him, her expression tired but determined. "Chief," she said softly, "it's a win. Maybe not the whole battle, but it's a step." Derek nodded, his gaze still on the patrol cars as they disappeared into the distance. "It is," he replied, though his voice carried the weight of unfinished business. He held the folder Karen had given him tightly in his hand, knowing it represented the next phase of the fight. The names inside weren't just individuals. They were symbols of a system that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. By the time Derek returned to the station, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the town. The team that had stood by him throughout the night was gathered in the briefing room, exhaustion evident on their faces, but replaced by something else, a sense of pride and hope. Derek addressed them with quiet gratitude, his words genuine and heartfelt. "You all made this possible," he said, looking each officer in the eye. "Tonight wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. It was about showing this town that we are here to serve and protect them, no matter how tough the fight gets." The room filled with murmurs of agreement, and Derek could see the morale in his team shifting. For the first time, they weren't just part of a department. They were part of a cause. In the days that followed, news of the arrests spread quickly. The townspeople, once wary of the police, began to feel a renewed sense of trust. Derek made it a point to hold community meetings, inviting residents to share their concerns and rebuild the bridge between the police force and the people they served. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in Cedar Heights began to change. One evening, Rick decided to take matters into his own hands. He and Jake followed Derek after work, tailing him as he walked through a quiet residential neighborhood. Rick had no concrete plan, just a growing sense of desperation. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. Rick shot him a look. "We're just keeping an eye on him, seeing what he's up to." Derek, of course, knew they were there. He spotted them almost immediately, but acted as though he hadn't. He continued walking, leading them toward a well-lit park where families were out enjoying the evening. Rick's frustration boiled over. "He's toying with us," he muttered. Jake looked nervous. "Maybe we should back off. If he catches us—" "He won't," Rick snapped. "Just stay quiet." But Derek had already made his move. Without breaking stride, he turned onto a busier street, disappearing into a crowd. By the time Rick and Jake realized they'd lost him, Derek was already back at his motel, preparing for the next phase of his plan. The game was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted. Rick and Jake were on edge, their confidence unraveling with each passing day. Derek, meanwhile, was patient. He knew the key to winning wasn't just exposing their corruption. It was dismantling the system that allowed it to thrive. And as the tension in Cedar Heights continued to build, one thing became clear. The reckoning was coming, and there was no escaping it. The tension in Cedar Heights had reached a breaking point. Rick was becoming reckless, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering anger that boiled over at the smallest provocation. Jake, caught between loyalty and fear, found himself questioning everything. Their once tight grip on the town was slipping, and they knew it, but they still didn't understand how far Derek was willing to go to bring them down. Derek had been meticulous, planting seeds of doubt among the officers who had silently condoned Rick and Jake's actions for years. He had shown them a way out, a chance to stand on the right side of history. Quietly, more officers began coming forward, sharing details that painted an even darker picture of Rick and Jake's activities. It wasn't just the money they had stolen or the people they had humiliated. It was the systemic fear they had spread, ensuring no one dared to challenge them. One night, Derek received a call from Karen Lopez. Her voice was steady but urgent. "Chief, I think they're planning something. Rick's been acting strange all day, and he was talking to Jake about shutting things down before it's too late." Derek thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. He knew Rick wouldn't go down quietly. The man was too proud, too paranoid, and too desperate to face the consequences of his actions. Derek had expected this. He'd been preparing for it. The next day, Derek arrived at the station earlier than usual. The atmosphere was tense, officers moving quietly through the halls, their usual chatter replaced by furtive glances and whispered conversations. Derek noticed Rick and Jake in a corner, speaking in hushed tones. When Rick looked up and saw Derek watching, his expression darkened. For the first time, Derek saw something in Rick's eyes that he hadn't before: fear. Derek called a department meeting that afternoon, inviting all officers to gather in the briefing room. He stood at the front, calm and composed, as the team settled into their seats. Rick and Jake sat near the back, their arms crossed and their expressions defiant. Derek began to speak, his voice steady but firm. "I've been here for a few weeks now," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "And I've seen a lot. I've seen dedication, bravery, and a willingness to serve this community. But I've also seen something else, something that needs to be addressed." The room grew still. Derek continued, his tone unwavering. "This department has a responsibility to uphold the law, not to abuse it. And let me be clear. Anyone who chooses to use their badge for personal gain, to intimidate, or to harm will be held accountable." Rick scoffed loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Big words, chief. But talk is cheap. Derek's gaze locked onto Rick's. "You're right, Officer Carson. Talk is cheap. That's why I've spent the last few weeks gathering evidence." The room erupted in murmurs, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Rick's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Evidence? Of what?" he challenged, his voice rising. Derek didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into a folder and pulled out a series of documents. "These are statements from members of the community, people who have been mistreated, harassed, and robbed. They've named names, and those names are right here." Rick's face turned red, but before he could speak, Derek held up a hand. "I'm not finished. I also have corroborating reports from within this department. Officers who've had enough of the corruption and fear." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. Rick, on the other hand, stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You think you can just waltz in here and accuse me? Accuse us? You've got nothing." Derek remained calm, his voice measured. "I have more than you think, Officer Carson. And I've already shared it with the mayor and the district attorney." Rick froze, his bravado momentarily cracking. The room was silent, all eyes on him. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but then he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the room. Jake hesitated, looking between Rick and Derek, before following reluctantly. The meeting ended shortly after, but the tension lingered. Derek knew this wasn't over. Rick wouldn't go quietly, and Jake was too entangled in his partner's schemes to walk away now. Derek's next move was crucial. That evening, Derek received a tip from Karen. Rick and Jake had been seen driving out toward an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a known hangout for questionable activities, a place where Rick had been spotted before during off-duty hours. Derek didn't hesitate. He called for backup, assembling a small team of trusted officers to join him. As they approached the warehouse, Derek's instincts kicked in. The building was dark, its windows broken and its exterior worn from years of neglect. Derek motioned for his team to spread out, covering all exits. He moved carefully, his flashlight cutting through the shadows as he approached the main entrance. Inside, voices echoed faintly. Derek recognized Rick's angry tone, followed by Jake's more hesitant responses. He signaled to his team, and they moved in, their presence swift and precise. Rick and Jake were caught off guard, their expressions a mix of shock and fury. Rick immediately went on the defensive. What is this, Collins? Some kind of ambush. Derek didn't flinch. This is accountability, Rick. You've run out of time. As the tension reached its peak, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath, the next moments poised to determine everything. The walls that had protected Rick and Jake for years were finally crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating, the kind of stillness that made even the faintest sound seem deafening. Derek kept his gaze locked on Rick, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the room. For a moment, it seemed as though Rick might surrender, the weight of his wrongdoings finally too much to bear. But then, in the thick silence, Derek noticed something odd, a flicker of movement behind a stack of crates. "Stay alert," Derek called softly to his team, motioning toward the area. His officers adjusted their positions, their focus now split between Rick, Jake, and the unseen threat in the shadows. Rick's smirk returned, his confidence oddly renewed. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you, Chief?" Rick said, his voice laced with defiance. "But you're still in over your head." Before Derek could respond, a loud clatter came from the corner of the warehouse. An older man stepped into view, his face familiar to Derek. It was Donnie Hayes, a known associate of Rick and someone Derek had suspected was involved in their schemes. Donnie's presence changed everything. He wasn't just an accomplice. He was the link to a much larger network of corruption Derek had only begun to uncover. "Rick, you brought them here." Donnie barked, his voice filled with anger. "What were you thinking?" Rick shrugged, his bravado faltering just slightly. "I didn't know they'd follow me. I had to." "You had to nothing." Donnie snapped, cutting him off. His gaze shifted to Derek, his expression hardening. "You're making a big mistake, Chief. You don't know who you're messing with." Derek stood his ground. "You're right, Donnie. I don't know everything, yet. But I know enough to bring this to an end." Donnie chuckled darkly. "You think it's that simple? This town runs on deals, and Rick and Jake were just the tip of the iceberg. You take me down, and you're opening a door you can't close." The revelation landed like a punch. Derek had suspected there were deeper layers to the corruption in Cedar Heights, but hearing it confirmed by someone like Donnie was a different matter. It wasn't just Rick and Jake. It was a web of deceit that had infiltrated the town, threatening to pull Derek into a much larger battle than he'd anticipated. Rick, emboldened by Donnie's presence, stepped forward. "See, Chief, you're outnumbered. Outplayed. This isn't about right or wrong anymore. It's about survival." Derek's team, though trained and steady, exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of what they were facing was palpable, and Derek knew he had to keep them focused. "It's always about right and wrong, Rick," he said firmly. "And no matter how deep this goes, the law is still the law." Donnie smirked, taking a step closer. "You talk a big game, Chief, but you're in my territory now. The people in this town might trust you for now, but they won't back you when they see how things really work." Derek ignored Donnie's taunts, his mind racing. He had anticipated resistance, but this was more than he'd planned for. The stakes weren't just about holding Rick and Jake accountable. It was about dismantling an entire system that thrived on fear and manipulation. And now, with Donnie in the picture, Derek realized just how high those stakes truly were. But Derek wasn't the only one thinking quickly. Jake, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Donnie, maybe we should just let it go. It's not worth it. Rick spun to face Jake, his expression incredulous. What are you talking about? You're in this as deep as I am. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting between Derek, Rick, and Donnie. Maybe. But that doesn't mean I want to go down for it. The room grew tense again as Jake's words hung in the air. Rick looked ready to explode, but Donnie cut him off with a sharp gesture. Enough. We're not doing this here. Donnie reached into his pocket, and for a moment, Derek's team tensed, their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. But Donnie only pulled out a phone, dialing a number and stepping away to speak quietly. Derek couldn't hear the conversation, but he could feel the gravity of it. Donnie wasn't just trying to get out of a tight spot. He was calling in reinforcements. Derek signaled his team to tighten their formation. Whatever Donnie was planning, it wasn't good. He needed to act fast. "Rick, Jake, this is your last chance," Derek said, his voice steady but firm. "You can walk out of here now and cooperate, or you can dig yourselves in deeper." Jake looked torn, his resolve weakening. But Rick shook his head, his pride blinding him to reason. "You don't get it, do you, Collins? This isn't just about us. You're fighting a losing battle." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension mounting with each passing second. Derek could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile line between order and chaos. He had to make his move, but the stakes had never been higher. The air in the warehouse felt electric, charged with tension that seemed ready to snap at any moment. Derek kept his focus sharp, his instincts screaming that the situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control. Donnie's phone call ended, and as he slid the device back into his pocket, he looked up with a cold, calculated smile. "Backup's on the way," Donnie said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "I hope you're ready for what's coming, Chief." Derek's heart raced, but outwardly he remained composed. "You can call whoever you want, Donnie. It won't change the truth." Rick laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The truth? You think the truth matters out here? People don't care about your principles, Collins. They care about power, and you're out of your league." Before Derek could respond, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside the warehouse filled the air. His officers stiffened, their eyes darting toward the windows as headlights cut through the darkness. The rumble of engines stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. Derek signaled for his team to hold their ground, his mind racing to assess the situation. Seconds later, a group of men entered the warehouse, their presence immediately commanding attention. They weren't officers, but their demeanor and posture suggested they were no strangers to confrontation. Derek recognized a few faces from reports, associates of Donnie, part of the network that had been quietly manipulating Cedar Heights for years. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You must be the new chief," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Heard a lot about you." Derek didn't flinch. "Then you know I'm not here to play games." The man chuckled, glancing at Donnie. "This guy's got guts. I'll give him that." Rick, emboldened by the reinforcements, stepped closer to Derek. "Looks like your little power trip is over, Chief. You're outnumbered." But before Rick could say another word, a new sound broke through the tension, a sharp, commanding voice from outside. "This is the Cedar Heights Police Department. Everyone inside, put your hands where we can see them." Derek's reinforcements had arrived. Karen Lopes had followed Derek's orders to the letter, coordinating with trusted officers to ensure they were ready to intervene at the right moment. The tide was turning, and Derek could see the realization dawn on Rick and Donnie's faces. "Looks like I'm not the one outnumbered," Derek said, his voice calm but resolute. The men who had arrived with Donnie hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. It was clear they hadn't anticipated facing a fully mobilized police force. Derek seized the moment. "This is your chance to walk away," he said, addressing the newcomers. "Whatever loyalty you think you owe Donnie, it's not worth your freedom." One by one, the men began backing toward the exit, their resolve crumbling. Donnie cursed under his breath, his plan unraveling before his eyes. Rick, however, wasn't ready to give up. In a desperate move, he lunged toward Derek, his fist swinging wildly. Derek sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, grabbing Rick's arm and twisting it behind his back. Rick struggled, but Derek held firm, his training and composure winning out. "It's over, Rick," Derek said, his voice steady. "Stop fighting." Jake, who had watched the entire scene unfold, finally cracked under the pressure. He dropped to his knees, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." Donnie, seeing his carefully constructed empire collapse, tried to make a run for it, but the officers outside were ready. He was quickly apprehended, his protests drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. As the dust settled, Derek stood in the center of the warehouse, his heart pounding but his expression calm. The main players had been taken down, their web of corruption exposed. But just as he began to feel the weight of victory, Karen approached him, her expression grave. "Chief," she said quietly, handing him a folder. "We found this in Rick's patrol car. You're going to want to see it." Derek opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents inside. They weren't just records of Rick and Donnie's activities. They were connections to higher-ups in the town, names of individuals Derek hadn't even suspected. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined, and while tonight was a victory, it was clear the fight was far from over. Derek closed the folder, his resolve hardening. Cedar Heights wasn't free yet, but for the first time in years, the town had hope. And Derek wasn't going to stop until every last thread of corruption was unraveled. As the early hours of the morning approached, the streets of Cedar Heights began to quiet, the chaos of the night finally subsiding. Derek stood outside the warehouse, watching as Rick, Jake, and Donnie were loaded into separate patrol cars. Their faces were a mixture of anger, shame, and fear, emotions Derek had seen countless times before, but never in such a deeply personal way. For weeks, these men had tried to undermine him, to strip him of his authority and integrity. But now, justice was finally taking its course. Karen stood beside him, her expression tired but determined. "Chief," she said softly, "it's a win. Maybe not the whole battle, but it's a step." Derek nodded, his gaze still on the patrol cars as they disappeared into the distance. "It is," he replied, though his voice carried the weight of unfinished business. He held the folder Karen had given him tightly in his hand, knowing it represented the next phase of the fight. The names inside weren't just individuals. They were symbols of a system that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. By the time Derek returned to the station, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the town. The team that had stood by him throughout the night was gathered in the briefing room, exhaustion evident on their faces, but replaced by something else, a sense of pride and hope. Derek addressed them with quiet gratitude, his words genuine and heartfelt. "You all made this possible," he said, looking each officer in the eye. "Tonight wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. It was about showing this town that we are here to serve and protect them, no matter how tough the fight gets." The room filled with murmurs of agreement, and Derek could see the morale in his team shifting. For the first time, they weren't just part of a department. They were part of a cause. In the days that followed, news of the arrests spread quickly. The townspeople, once wary of the police, began to feel a renewed sense of trust. Derek made it a point to hold community meetings, inviting residents to share their concerns and rebuild the bridge between the police force and the people they served. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in Cedar Heights began to change. Derek nodded, encouraging Marcus to continue. The stories were heartbreaking. Innocent people harassed, humiliated, and robbed by the very officers who were supposed to protect them. As Derek left the diner that night, he felt the weight of his responsibility more heavily than ever. This wasn't just about Rick and Jake anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, proving to the people of Cedar Heights that justice could prevail. But Rick and Jake weren't going down without a fight. They could sense the shift in the air, the way people looked at them differently now. And they were determined to find out who was behind it. What they didn't know was that Derek was always one step ahead, carefully laying the groundwork for a reckoning they would never see coming. Rick's paranoia grew by the day, and his frustration started to boil over. He could feel eyes on him wherever he went, even if no one was actually watching. At first, he brushed it off as nerves, but then small things started happening. Subtle changes that felt like the walls were closing in. An officer he considered an ally avoided him in the locker room. A clerk in records gave him a strange look when he came to drop off his reports. It was as if the air around him had shifted, and he didn't know why. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't hide his discomfort anymore. He was jumpy during their patrols, hesitant where he used to be confident. Rick noticed and finally snapped one afternoon. "What's your deal?" Rick barked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Jake glanced over, his face pale. "It's him, Rick. The new chief. He knows something. I can feel it." Rick rolled his eyes, but didn't dismiss Jake's concern outright. "You're imagining things. He's all talk. Trust me, he's not gonna do a thing." But even as Rick said the words, doubt crept in. There was something unsettling about Derek's calm demeanor, the way he carried himself like he had nothing to prove, but everything under control. It was a stark contrast to Rick's bluster, and that difference gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Derek was making quiet progress. His investigation had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Rick and Jake weren't just acting on their own. Other officers in the department, while not directly involved, had turned a blind eye to their actions. It was a culture of complicity, where silence was safer than standing up. Derek knew dismantling this wouldn't be as simple as firing 2 bad cops. He had to address the entire system. One night, as Derek sat at his motel desk, he reviewed the latest reports from his allies within the department. Officer Karen Lopez had been one of the first to come forward, confiding in Derek about her own frustrations. She wasn't involved in Rick and Jake's schemes, but she'd seen enough to know something was wrong. "They're untouchable," she'd said during one of their meetings. "Or at least they think they are. No one wants to cross them because they're afraid of retaliation." Derek had thanked her for her honesty and asked her to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Karen's reports were detailed, painting a picture of 2 officers who believed they owned the town. But she'd also highlighted something Derek hadn't expected: a growing unease among the rest of the department. Rick and Jake's arrogance was starting to wear thin, even among those who had stayed silent. This gave Derek an idea. He began orchestrating subtle changes within the precinct, shifting patrol schedules, reassigning cases, and introducing mandatory ethics training. On the surface, these changes seemed routine, but in reality, they were calculated moves designed to shake the foundation of Rick and Jake's perceived power. Rick noticed. He couldn't put his finger on it, but things felt different. One morning, he stormed into the chief's office, slamming the door behind him. "Chief Collins," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "mind explaining why my patrol schedule got changed without anyone telling me?" Derek looked up from his desk, his expression calm but firm. Officer Carson, the schedules are updated regularly based on department needs. If there's an issue, you're welcome to file a request for review. Rick's jaw tightened. It's not just the schedule. Everything around here feels off. Derek leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Off, or maybe just different. Change can be uncomfortable, especially when it challenges the status quo. Rick glared at him, but said nothing. After a moment, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Outside, Jake was waiting. What did he say? Rick shook his head, his anger barely contained. He's messing with us. I don't know how yet, but I'm gonna find out.